Hey, Michael here from eBike Motor Repair. I'm going to do a really basic video on motor removal. The bike we're going to be working on today is actually a Turbo Levo from 2017. This video is for, general removal for most every mid-drive motor. I mean, the principles should be about the same, no matter which ones. I mean, sure, there's some little nuances that are different from the manufacturers, both different from the motors, as well as how the bicycle manufacturers configured how these motors are mounted in there. But the principles are still the same. Tell you what, if enough comments pop up with questions, we may do specific videos. But again, this one is specifically a Brose being pulled out of a Specialized Turbo Levo. And, it should apply to most of your mid-drive systems. This is a 2017 Turbo Levo, to be exact, by Specialized. But removal process is going to be pretty universal, definitely with some nuances, specific to each of the manufacturers. Remove your battery. In the Levo, the battery's in here. There's a nut here that you turn and it slides out. The whole battery falls out. But whatever bike configuration you have, whatever battery configuration you have, let's just go ahead and remove the battery and take it out of the system altogether. Just make sure that you're in your smallest gear, and if you have a clutch on your derailleur, disengage the clutch. Remove crank arms, chain. There's different kinds of configurations for crank pullers. Some have like an Allen key that's inset in there. That's sort of a self-installed puller mechanism. Other crank sets you have to thread in an actual crank puller. If you need a crank puller, let us know. We sell them. If you're not sure, call us. We can help you troubleshoot and figure it out. Sometimes these are a little harder at first. We actually have taken this one off quite a few times just for demonstrations. If it feels really hard, it's okay. It's because they are really torqued down. I think the factory torque specs on those are about 50 Newton meters. You can thread the crank arm just gently or lightly back on the opposite side of the chain to give you something to have leverage with. Next, you're going to need a lock ring nut tool remover. This removes the lock ring nut. These are sometimes specific to certain lock ring nuts. There's different sizes for some of the different motors. If you're stuck on this step and you need a little help, give us a call and we'll help you figure out which one is suitable for what motor you're trying to remove.
Actually, it's already loose.
If that chain is hard to pull off by hand, you can sometimes use a pulley puller, a really cheap one that you can get from the auto parts store to pull and pry from right behind those two parts. Something kind of like this. I mean, there's all kinds of different little pulley pullers. Just as long as it fits behind the sprocket, you can use it to pull it off. Okay, next up, what you're going to want to do is remove any kind of plastic housing around the motor. Sometimes they're, in most cases, they are on both sides.
Edit. Okay.
And obviously when you're pulling this out, be careful not to drop it. Also careful of any internal routing cables, you know, brake lines, dropper post lines, everything like that. All right, and putting it back in is pretty much a reversal of taking it out, of course, but we'll still walk through. You know, before you stick the motor in there, it's good to, you know, stick your hand in, clear any wires or battery leads, anything like that, and gently put it back in. Torque specs are all different on these models. Consult your bike shop for the specific torque specs. We use an impact wrench drill to do ours. Maybe not by the book, but they stay in place. Again, this stage, remember to plug the plugs back into their appropriate holes. You'd be so surprised how many calls we get daily saying, "Oh, my motor doesn't work. It doesn't work." Well, did you plug it in right? You know, of course. Oh, yeah, we plug it in right. It's like, well, did you plug it in right? And upon second inspection, in many cases, sure enough, just wasn't plugged in right. It's a very simple thing to accidentally get wrong, and your motor won't work if it's not plugged in properly. So, a couple of things you'll also want to make sure. Check and make sure your battery is plugged in all the way. There's a little clip on the side of it. Make sure it's pushed all the way in until that clips in place, and make sure all your different light ports and controllers and everything are plugged back in. Make sure you look inside of those keyways, inside the plugs, to make sure they are aligned properly. So it's not just the right hole, it's also the right orientation within each hole. Again, they are keyed. It is surprisingly easy to overpower and plug them in the wrong place, but when they do go in, it's usually nice and smooth. And the best way I can think to describe it is it feels right. If you have a question about this, do not hesitate to reach out to us. Again, just returning the side covers to their appropriate places. In case you're wondering, if you lose any of your bolts that hold side cases on, we don't sell those parts. That's a bike shop part. So, but a lot of these machine screws are fairly standard. If you have a company that you purchase fasteners from, it might be able to help you. You might have to buy 100 of them, but nevertheless, you may not necessarily have to be dependent on the bike shop for those parts. But they are not parts from us. We don't supply them. We don't carry them. Those are the bike manufacturers have a say in what's used here, not the motor manufacturer. So that's not anything to do with Brose.
Not even, you know? It's not even doing it.
And start putting your crank arms back on. A lot of these manufacturers will have different torque specs for the crank arms. Many of them are pretty tight, like close to 50 Newton meters. But before we advise you on specifics of crank arm torque specs, just consult your bike shop, because the different manufacturers may have used different configurations. But torque specs are quite important. Otherwise, you can end up causing a lot of damage to the shaft or to the inside of the crank arm where it connects. And again, in the reversing of taking apart, we put it back together in the opposite direction. Put on your sprocket and your lock ring nut. Again, some of these thread opposite hand. Off the top of my head, I can't tell you throughout all the mid-drive manufacturers which ones thread which directions. You can use a big crescent wrench on the outside of this tool, or it also has place for a socket drive in the center. Either one is fine. And you see you can use the other crank as leverage. Same thing, torque specs are sometimes different on the lock ring nut from the manufacturers, the various manufacturers. A lot of the lock ring nuts will even have a torque spec written on the nut, but please be sure you follow that torque spec as well. Otherwise your chain ring will just keep coming loose. And when it's sitting behind a crank arm that's torqued down to 50 Newton meters, that's not exactly a quick, easy trail fix. Reminder, when you put your chain back on, if you have a narrow wide's here, you know, you got a wide tooth, a narrow tooth, a wide tooth, so on and so forth, hence the name narrow wide. Make sure that it's lined up and going into the appropriate narrow slots in the chain, wide slots in the chain. And of course, don't want your derailleur slapping around on the trail, so if you disengage the clutch, if your derailleur is equipped with one, be sure you turn it back on. Once you're at this stage, if you disconnected your battery lead, go ahead and plug it back in. If you took your whole battery out, go ahead and reinstall it. You should be safe at this point. And that's basically it. So now that we've got the motor back in, the crank arm's back on, the chain back on, everything's back in. A couple of things. Don't go bench testing it. Get all excited like, hey, my motor's back in. Don't leave it on the stand and test it, because the motor requires torsion to know even to give any assist. So we get a lot of customers that panic. They'll test, they'll spin it out on the stand and the motor won't provide assist. And I don't know. If this happens to you, don't panic. Just take it off the stand, go take it for a quick spin, make sure it works right. A couple of little things that can happen. Sometimes you might get 8, 9 pedals in and then the motor drops out. If that happens, in 99% of the times, it's just the wheel sensor isn't plugged in the right place or in the right orientation. Go double check it. If it doesn't work at all, same thing. Go check all the leads. I know it seems like a lot of extra work, but we see this a lot in troubleshooting. It's almost every single case. If your motor worked taking it out, let's say you're just replacing a belt or a small part or something like that. If your motor worked before you took it out and it had no error codes, it should work going back in. And if it doesn't, most likely something somewhere wasn't plugged back in properly. So just check all your connections, check your battery, check all the different ports, your controllers, everything. Make sure not only are they plugged back in the right holes, but they're also, again, in the right orientation. Down inside of there, as a reminder, is a little keyway in each one of those. They're designed not to be plugged back into the wrong place, but again, it's surprisingly easy to do. So that's our video for basic removal. If you have extra questions, feel free to reach out directly to us. Feel free to comment. Let us know if there's anything we missed. We're happy to help any way we can.